holidays, everyone. It's me, Mrs. Vendetti. I'm back with Cranberry Christmas. Do you remember when we read Cranberry Thanksgiving by Wende and Devlin? And I told you at the end of that story that there was another cranberry story. Well, here it is. This is one of my favorite books, Cranberry Christmas. I'm going to read this story today to my beautiful daughter, Claire, and our lovely little Bichon poodle, Luna. Say hi, Luna. Hi. Okay. And I'm going to read this story to all of you. So let's take a sip of tea. Delicious. And I want to thank Sophia for giving me that beautiful mug. And let's hear Cranberry Christmas by Harry and Wende Devlin. I think you're going to recognize some of these characters. Christmas was coming. Snow was on the cranberry bog, the smell of pine in the wind, and the fresh water pond frozen smooth. Mr. Whiskers, looking out from his kitchen window, was deep in gloom. Christmas was only 3 days away, and his pond should have been filled with skaters. Skaters in bright sweaters, laughing, with their scarves flying in the wind, and he should have been there, teaching them all to twirl and do figure eights. Poor Mr. Whiskers. But old Cyrus Grape had changed all that. He moved in next door to Mr. Whiskers into the stone house on the rise and claimed that the pond was on his land. Cyrus didn't like children. Whenever he saw them on the pond, he would hop on his sled and slide bumpity-bump down the hill. Scat! Off my pond, or I'll have the sheriff after you, Cyrus would holler about as he shook his cane and chased the skaters to the snowy banks. It's my pond, you old scoundrel! Mine! Mr. Whiskers would boom back. See Mr. Whiskers? He's a really good ice skater. But when the old sea captain searched through the attic, the desk, and the cellar of his little gray cottage, he could find nothing to prove that he owned the pond. He began to wonder if he did own the pond. Mr. Whiskers brooded. Cyrus Grape cackled, and the little children sadly hung up their skates. Here's Maggie. See Maggie there? Oh, she's such a wonderful girl. And she has a little tear coming down her face. Well, today there were new troubles for Mr. Whiskers. A letter from his persnickety sister Sarah in the city announced that she was coming for Christmas. And after the holidays, she expected him to come back to the city to live with her. You can't take care of yourself. Your house looks like a shipwreck, and your money box is always empty, she scolded in her letter. Mr. Whiskers frowned. He liked the way he took care of himself. In the summer, he clammed and felt the water and sand on his bare feet. In the winter, he ice skated with the children all around him like a school of fish. To think of leaving Cranberry Port. The idea of living in the city with Sarah and her striped cat made Mr. Whiskers furious. Fuming, he took his troubles to Maggie and Grandmother, who lived in a farmhouse on the other side of the dunes. "Suffering codfish, what can I do?" He waved his letter in their kitchen. When Grandmother heard Mr. Whiskers' news, she held her head. "A guest at Mr. Whiskers' jumbled house? You haven't borrowed my broom since summer," she chided. "I sweep in the spring," said Mr. Whiskers, looking at the ceiling. Grandmother shook her head. She and Maggie didn't waste time. Mr. Whiskers certainly needed help. In a few minutes, loaded with Grandmother's soap and polish and bristling with brooms and brushes, all three took the path to Mr. Whiskers' house over the dunes on the ocean side. How they worked! How they worked! Maggie washed the windows. Mr. Whiskers scrubbed the floor. Grandmother dusted and gave orders. "What's behind this couch?" "Lobster pots," Mr. Whiskers answered. "What's in the bathtub?" "My shell collection," growled Mr. Whiskers. "Out with all of them," ordered Grandmother. I would listen to Grandmother, wouldn't you? Mr. Whiskers grumbled about Persnickety's sisters and certain grandmothers, but he did as he was told. It was at the end of the second day of helping Mr. Whiskers that the accident happened. Maggie had trimmed the pine tree and baked her favorite cranberry cookies. She had just put the last pan away when she heard a crash in the pantry. Suddenly, there were Mr. Whiskers' feet sticking right through the ceiling. Maggie raced upstairs. Poor Mr. Whiskers. With help from Maggie, he groaned and pulled himself up. It was then that Maggie spied the dusty black and gold box between the floor and the ceiling. Carefully, they pulled it into the light. "A treasure, Mr. Whiskers?" said Maggie with shining eyes. "Not in my house," said Mr. Whiskers, sighing as he carried the box downstairs. He was right. It was filled with photographs and dusty old papers. But long after Maggie left, Mr. Whiskers was still studying the papers in the orange light of the afternoon. He opened the last stiff parchment and began to smile. Now he chuckled. Then he slapped his knee and shouted, "Suffering codfish!" Christmas Eve brought a light snow to Cranberry Port, and the smell of sea was in the air. Mr. Whiskers' sister, Sarah, a round, brown-eyed woman with a flowered bag, arrived from the train station in Cranberry Port's only taxicab. Mr. Whiskers hugged her and introduced Sarah all around. She turned and stared at the cottage. "How clean your windows are, brother!" "I love to shine the blinking things," he boomed. Grandmother sniffed, and Maggie laughed. It does look pretty, doesn't it? But when Sarah went inside the cottage, she could scarcely believe her eyes. She had never seen such a beautiful sight. The wooden table was polished and set with holly and red candles. And the Christmas tree, it was a celebration of seashells. There had been no money for ornaments, so Maggie and Mr. Whiskers had painted the shell collection. It glistened with silver and gold. There were chains of snail shells, silver clam shells, and a golden starfish at the top. Sarah clapped her hands. "Brother, you are a wonder." Mr. Whiskers smiled behind his whiskers. The night was a triumph. From supper of clam chowder, grandmother's famous bread, hot spiced cider, and Maggie's cranberry cookies, to the singing of carols around the old piano. Mr. Whiskers pretended to cover his ears whenever grandmother trilled on the high notes. And there were gifts from the old sea captain. A sea-worn bottle, blue as a sapphire, for grandmother, a giant pink shell for Maggie, and a small ivory box for Sarah. Sarah dipped into her flowery bag and presented her brother with a new red knitted scarf and mittens. It was midnight. As Maggie left, Mr. Whiskers whispered something in her ear that the children of Cranberryport should be at the pond at noon tomorrow. He winked in the most mysterious way. Christmas afternoon was cold and bright. Mr. Whiskers darted among the skaters and had just stopped to catch his breath when he heard the voice of Cyrus Grape. "Arrest them, Sheriff!" Boy, he's mean. The kids look scared. Don't they look scared, honey? Behind Cyrus stood a tall man with a broad-brimmed hat. There were screams as the skaters fled in every direction, all except for Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Whiskers pretended he hadn't heard a thing. He skated. He whirled. And then he stretched his arms and glided like a great black whiskered bird. He's a really good skater. Mr. Grape's face grew red. "Off to jail with you!" Cyrus screeched, pulling the sheriff after Mr. Whiskers. "I'm skating on my own pond, you old fraud," said Mr. Whiskers, turning and slowing down until he faced Cyrus Grape. Slowly, triumphantly, he reached into the pocket of his brass-buttoned coat and drew out a yellowed, red-sealed paper and waved it under Cyrus Grape's long nose. He handed it to the sheriff. The sheriff studied the paper carefully and looked at Mr. Grape. "This paper proves that the pond belongs to Mr. Whiskers," he said. "You, sir, are trespassing on Mr. Whiskers' pond." Cyrus Grape turned a deeper red and roared with rage. He wound his muffler, a it's like a scarf, around his face and started up the rise to his house, pulling the sled behind him. Mr. Whiskers turned to the children and raised his hand for silence. My pond is yours to skate on whenever you like. Merry Christmas to all. The crowd cheered. Sarah whispered to him, My goodness, you certainly can take care of yourself. And all of Cranberry Port, too. Mr. Whiskers offered his arm to Maggie for a turn on the ice. They skated off joyfully. I am a wonder, he said to Maggie, and even the Whiskers couldn't hide the smile on Mr. Whiskers' face. Now, you see, one of the things that's special about the Cranberry series of books by Harry and Wende Devlin are that there's a recipe at the end of each of the books. And so here for Cranberry Christmas, we have Maggie's favorite cranberry cookies. What do you think, Claire? You want to make these cookies? I think we will. Happy Christmas, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the story.